Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today.
Hey, you're listening to a podcast by Skate Bylines, a spot for skateboarding journalism. I'm your host, Farran Golding. I'm the editor at large for Quartersnacks. I'm the associate editor at Closer Skateboarding. I'm a freelance journalist, and I recently launched Skate Bylines. Skate Bylines is a publisher of original stories, and we take an interest in the ecology of skateboarding media. So whether you're interested in skateboarding and all that goes with it, or you're interested in understanding how skateboarding media works, this might be a place for you. Here, we unpack the process of creating a story about skateboarding with the author behind it. On today's episode, we're going for a roll underneath the Manhattan Bridge to learn about how municipal space works in New York City. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy this first episode. When you're visiting the Lower East Side Skatepark in New York, you get pretty familiar with this sound. It's the crash of wheels hitting a metal wall ride by the skatepark's entrance, but it's a racket that finds your ears no matter what pocket of the 20,000 square feet of space you're in. It's one of two noises you hear a lot when you skate in the park, the other being trains running overhead across the Manhattan Bridge. The Lower East Side Skatepark, or L.E.S. Park, opened on Go Skateboarding Day 2012. It was designed and orchestrated by Steve Rodriguez, with assistance from Architecture for Humanity, and followed donations from Nike and the Skatepark Project, then known as the Tony Hawk Foundation, amongst others. It bears consideration that L.E.S. set a precedent for skatepark construction across New York in the following years. The park's opening also overlaps with a significant period for New York itself in skate culture, as throughout the early to mid-2010s it became a prominent location for skaters to build a career, as the city explored some of the most notable aspects of contemporary skateboarding from the past decade. My guest today, Ian Browning, is a journalist from Buffalo, upstate New York. During his college years at journalism school in Boston, he began visiting New York City and has now lived in Brooklyn for over a decade. Writing for Quartersnacks in 2022, Ian describes L.E.S. Park as the Civic Centre of New York skateboarding in a story coinciding with the park's 10-year anniversary. Today he talks about the history of L.E.S., the skate park and the neighbourhood itself, and explains how the piece came to be. I hope you enjoy the show. We're chatting today about your story, Civic Centre, a profile of the L.E.S. skate park at 10 years. We're a couple of years out past that. But the reason I wanted to talk to you specifically is L.E.S. Park was the first place I skated the very first time I visited New York in 2016. And the park was pretty new then, and something that jumped out at me when I went back in 2022 was it had weathered quite a bit in those years. So what's your earliest memory of skating L.E.S. and why was the park itself, 10 years after the fact of it being built in the form it exists now, important enough for you to write this profile on it?
So I was not in New York City when L.E.S. was constructed. I was finishing college, for lack of a better term, in Boston. You know, it made waves at that point. There are a lot of concrete skate parks on the East Coast right now, but anything new that popped up was pretty remarkable and newsworthy. I skipped my college graduation to go to a skate park that had just opened up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. It's the size of a shoebox. It's a fun little park. But point being, it was just like, holy shit, we have the opportunity to skate this kind of stuff that was never around growing up in the Northeast for me. I was pegged to opening for Go Skateboard Day. I didn't go down for that. It wasn't like so monumental that it was like, oh my gosh, there's a skate park. But that Thanksgiving, so around November of that year, my wife and I came just to have dinner with a friend down here. That was number one on my itinerary. Like, I would really like to go check out this new park. Had a lot of fun skating there. But to me, it always maintained that level of prominence and importance.
I'll take you around the park a little bit.
Steve Rodriguez talking to New York Skateboarding in 2012.
We're standing on the pyramid. This is basically sort of like a throwback to the park that was here, kind of like in memory of the park in a way. Something you really have to think about when designing parks and like trying to make the best experience for the kids and for everybody really, is to just have a park that flows, that you can basically, even if you can't do a single trick, that you can just ride around and have fun.
It was where every event that happened in New York City, or a lot of the events that were happening in New York, would coincide with like a demo there. It was a monumental achievement to get a big concrete park that flowed and offered what you'd see in California or on the West Coast in general. And yeah, I moved to New York, I guess the year after that. And people would still skate there a lot, but the city saw the positive reception to it, opened up more skate parks, and it lost a little bit of the newness and the excitement. It's 10:28 in the morning. I guarantee you there are probably at least 15 people skating there right now. But it lost a little bit of the spotlight as the city was able to just afford more skate parks to different neighborhoods and different boroughs. But to me, it always felt like a very centralized one still. As the spotlight kind of spread out a little bit, I always felt like L.E.S. remained the figurehead of all of the skate parks within the city.
What can you tell me about the older incarnation to L.E.S. prior to the one we know today?
I never skated the old one. It was dingy. It was at one point in time a basketball court. Steve Rodriguez had been forever tirelessly advocating for the Brooklyn Banks, and I think in lieu of actually getting progress on the banks, the city council was willing to kick down some money for a skate park there. They brought in some prefab obstacles that kind of got built on a lot of the skate parks here. Someone will drag something that's maybe functional as a skate park object and just leave it there, and the parks department is like, okay, we have something new. There were slabs of granite and some other stuff to grind in addition to the prefab stuff that was there, but it was all on a basketball court. They sealed it with a terrible sealant that was not designed for skate parks. Anytime you fell, anything that skidded across it would just leave this like viscous black sludge that was impossible to get off of whatever garment you were wearing. I think one of the first epically latereds where they have Dill just skating around in Manhattan. He's doing tricks there.
It's like people have no idea like how fucking hard it is. Like it's unfathomable how really difficult it is to be like, all right, there's natural street skateboarding, go do it. You don't know a thing about skateboarding. Like, you don't know shit.
To me, the thing that makes L.E.S. such a good skate park is that there's a ton of space and everything's about 3 feet high. What do you think contributes to its longevity as a good skate park?
I think the space is a big thing. There's a tendency a lot of the time with skate park designers, it's like a kid in a candy shop situation sometimes, I think. Or maybe there's like a checklist and you end up with like some features that get the space that they deserve and some features where things get crammed into corners. And I like that the L.E.S. park, there's definitely still some of that going on, but it's pretty easy to flow through there. It doesn't feel too congested. You don't feel like you're just waiting in line to skate one thing and then jumping onto the deck on the other side and waiting for a bunch of teenagers to go again. If the park is empty, you could stand in any corner and drop in or start pushing and flow and touch every obstacle, which I really like. I don't care for a skate park that's like 30 square feet, 10 foot of run up, one obstacle, and then 10 feet of run out the other direction. I need space to figure out my footing and figure out what I want to do.
Is this it, priest? The Pope's new army? A few crusty bitches and a handful of ragtags?
I know, Bill. You swore this was a battle between warriors. So warriors is what I brought.
On my challenge, by the ancient laws of combat, we are met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all. Who holds sway over the 5 points?
Sidetracking away from skating for a minute, if you read the book Low Life, pretty much like the gangs of New York era of that part of New York City. 5 Points, the Bowery, Lower East Side.
I have not read the book Low Life, but yeah, definitely familiar with Lower East Side's cultural history.
Could you share a bit of the layman's guide to that?
Yeah, the Lower East Side and that part of Manhattan, it's close to the water, was initially developed a seaport kind of industrial area. New York City grew voluminously at some point in time very quickly along with that. You know, there's a lot of housing kind of running into that. And I think in a true urban sense, housing at some point in time directly stacked on top of the kind of industrial commercial applications or whatever. But the Lower East Side has always been, I think because of the conditions that I just described, for a long time, it was a very working class, ethnically religious, just diversity in general. Farther north on Manhattan, you have Central Park and these kind of more classic neighborhoods, stereotypically desirable ones. And the Lower East Side falls into that category now because of all of the art and culture that's kind of bubbled up from being a dense and diverse immigrant community.
It's in the headline that you suggest L.E.S. as a civic centre of New York skateboarding, and in the piece you write, this is you word for word, if you subscribe to the idea that the Civic Centre is the metaphorical hub of a city, it only makes sense that L.E.S. would be the holy ground for New York City skateboarding. For 3 kids that live in Parkchester, Gowanus, or Sunnyside to link up to skate, it's a reasonable meet-up spot. And if you're trying to throw a demo or contest, it is also well suited to handle the crowds. But most importantly, it has about 30 trash cans a Nesta needs to get to work on emptying them. That's kind of the nutshell paragraph of the piece, and we'll get to who Nesta is very shortly. But that idea of a skate park as a civic centre I find interesting. I think you completely justify that phrase and the headline of the story there. But I think it's mostly interesting because I think the idea of something as a civic centre for skateboarding would more often be attributed to a street spot. And is that something that you wrestled with at all when you were writing the story?
That's a good question. So here's how I'll answer it. Tompkins Square Park's reputation precedes itself. I have been reading about it on earlier iterations of Quartersnacks long before coming down and regularly spending time and skating in the city. And I think a street spot like Tompkins and a sanctioned skate park like the L.E.S. park exist almost in parallel. There's something very valuable about a skate park, I think. I would prefer to be skating flat on a tennis court to skating a skate park, I think, a lot of the time. But there's something indelible about a skate park offering you, at least during the time that it's open, a place where you can go skate unbothered, uninterrupted. If you are learning how to skateboard. If you grew up around Tompkins, some of the kids probably learned how to push and roll around and do all of that sort of stuff there. I'm like drawing a hypothetical person here, but if you don't have skateboarding in your neighborhood and you want to learn how to start, that's what a skate park offers to a lot of people, is like an accessible first point of how do I like connect with this culture? Maybe you got a board and you pushed around on your sidewalk, driveway, whatever you have around, going to a skate park or a skate spot. But, I think skate parks really offer that next step of connecting with culture at large, meeting other skateboarders, kind of figuring out how to do it. Because it's such an individual practice, but there's a lot of social etiquette that goes into it, not snaking people, waiting your turn, et cetera, et cetera. And skate parks oftentimes are not the best displays of this behavior, but for some people, for a lot of people, and the people that maybe get it and stick along with it in long term, that's where you start to learn some of like the social etiquette and things like that. You almost absorb it peripherally. I've broken every rule at some point in time in, 20 something years of skateboarding, but you also see other people do it. There might be someone giving lessons one-on-one to a kid at the park, but you're not necessarily going to go there and see posted rules. It's interesting because it really is just an unspoken understanding of how, because skateboarding works at a different speed than as a pedestrian. Not to get into a trans world video, skateboarders see the world differently monologue, but you start to adjust, understand timing and what works and what gets in people's way and things like that.
Considering like that proximity of Brooklyn Banks to L.E.S. and the idea of writing about a place as a civic centre, I do wonder if, had the Banks stayed skateable from its heyday till today, you very well could have been writing this story about the Brooklyn Banks.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I didn't come to New York until 2010, so I missed out on the 90s. But yeah, I mean, the 90s are full of stories about essentially skating back and forth from Supreme, which is close to Astor Place, down to the Banks and back and forth. And there are these two kind of hubs where people would meet up and link up and skate. Now that skate parks are around, it's interesting just talking about from the context of like where things were in 2011 to today, where I feel like there are more places. Like Tompkins is a legal spot now. You don't have to worry about potentially getting kicked out by a roller hockey team like you did at the time. There's always going to be these sort of central hubs, whether they're defined as a skate park or whether it's just, the Astor Place curb, as people skated it, was a traffic island where you didn't really run into a ton of traffic, and it became this central thing because it's just easy for people to link up there. And I think that's a lot of it in New York. It's really easy to get around sometimes, but it's also big. There are some places to get that are easier than others. I borrowed the Civic Centre idea in part from the fact that City Hall, Blubba, the federal courthouses, all of that stuff comes out of the redevelopment of the 5 Points neighborhood. But that is also like almost all the trains go to Manhattan and almost all of the trains run through that southernmost tip there. I think that is a major factor in establishing the foothold that it has as well. Is like if this was out at the end of one train line. You know, you were coming from a different borough and you have to spend an hour and a half to get there. There's not going to be as many people as there will be at this park still years later on a sunny day. And it's because it's really easy to get there. And then once you're there, everybody's warmed up. There's other spots to go to from there.
Another line from the story that I wanted to hone in on is having multiple places where kids could skate for 6 hours straight laid groundwork for New York to establish itself as a viable third option for skaters trying to make waves in an industry that traditionally focused most of its resources and attention between San Francisco and San Diego. The period where L.E.S. pops up coincides with this sort of early to mid 2010s renaissance where New York becomes a place that has a lot of eyes on it. 2010 to 2015, there's Johnny Wilson's crew.
Nice to meet you. I'm an artist.
Bronze.
56K.
Cherry.
You're the Courthouse Kid.
You know it.
Static 4.
This is a Brooklyn-bound 4 express train.
I think those had a lot of like far-reaching effect on why skaters my age, born in like 95, gravitated to New York and East Coast skateboarding. To backtrack to your quote, it's interesting that L.E.S. exists in this vacuum of a lot of things happening in New York and on the East Coast. What else do you think have been the main developments in that early to mid 2010s era that made New York so significant within skateboarding?
I think a lot of it is really hinged on late Web 2.0. This kind of like early social media, as well as like being able to host videos online. I don't really know what the industry perception of skateboarding in New York was in like 2001 or 1996. But I know that by the time I was in college, I could read early Quartersnacks. There was a lot of cool edits coming out of there. You know, even before Epically Latered as a series, which I think was another watershed moment, you had Pat Odell's just Epically Latered website. You'd see photo blogs. I was like, oh, cool. Like there's a lot happening in New York. There's a lot of people skating here. There was just this real affirmation that you can skate here. There's a lot of spots. There's really cool stuff. Yeah, I obviously saw Bobby Pulio in Static 2 earlier than that, but it's like there's a whole city to be skated here. The impression that I always had was that it was too expensive for skateboarders to like fuck off and be skateboarders there. Or maybe it was too difficult or whatever. And seeing some of that stuff that I just described, I was in college in Boston, which was 4 hours away, but there at the time was a Chinatown bus that would run from Chinatown in Boston to Chinatown in Manhattan for $15 each way. And it was like, yeah, cool. You can go down on the weekend and be back up on Monday and just have fun skating in, you know, downtown Manhattan in 2009. It was a fun time to be 21.
When it comes to the story for Quartersnacks, how did you map out the approach? You make it very interesting with a very heavy municipal focus about park space with L.E.S. as a lens to explore that. Did you have like this almost checklist of various things you wanted to discuss with it?
This definitely evolved over time, but the initial concept that I set out with was just looking at the aftermath of it. Like I said, skate parks went from, someone's going to tell me in the comments is going to tell me that this is wrong, but there were 3 or 4 skate parks in New York City when L.E.S. opened. And like I said, it set off a real wave of a ton of them. And I was interested in how that works. You know, is there a skate park department at the New York City Parks Department? New York City has great parks, really cool, like innovative stuff. I have kids. I've gone to a lot of different playgrounds in a lot of different cities. And New York City, because it's so dense, makes a point to include parks in a lot of tight spaces. And I think because of the spatial concerns, in addition to the numbers, is willing to kind of like take chances and do things that are a little bit different than like every playground ever, which is really cool. So I was curious as an agency what their approach is to skate parks. I didn't really know how to do that. I reached out to Steve Rodriguez, who connected me with someone higher up at parks, and I had kind of told him the idea of I was looking for a day in the life slice of like what it takes to maintain these things. He agreed to help connect me with a park supervisor. If my memory serves me correctly, COVID lockdowns happened. Initially, life got a little bit in the way, and I picked it back up in the end of 2021.
You open the story talking to Nestor, who's a Parks Department member. How did he become the protagonist of the story, or your entryway into it, which I thought was really novel? I mean, the opening line of the story itself, to the effect of, tell me how someone shits on a wall, is a bit of a broadside of an open.
I got incredibly lucky. So I pitched the story in 21, and Eric Adams, who's the current mayor, took over in 2022 and has been, generally speaking, curtailing cooperation with press, like, on any level. So by the time I had formally tried to, like, all right, cool, we're going to do this, I'm going to reach out to Parks press offices, my connect that I had previously made had basically said, like, no, we can't do that anymore. I went back and forth with the Parks press people who maybe didn't understand the ask. Maybe they were really busy, or maybe they were like, was fucking website called Quartersnacks? What is this? Like, we don't have time for this. So I was persistent in emails and calls, but it was just continually brushed off left, right, up, down. And it finally came down to Christian Kerr, who took the photos with me, and I were talking, and it was just like, all right, so this park is listed as opening up at 7 a.m. on the park's website, which means that someone comes, in theory, at 7 o'clock to open the gates. And what we want to do is get on city bikes at 6:30 in the morning and bike over there and just be there when this guy shows up at 7. Hell of a long shot. I really appreciate Christian being down to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning on this adventure with me, but it worked in a way that I could have never anticipated that it would, and that I spoke to Nestor. He was a great guy to talk to, and somebody that I know that he was not allowed to speak on the record, but he's the type of guy that I could come down at 7 o'clock in the morning and be like, hey, we're doing this story for this skateboard website. What do you think about it? And he was like oh, you want to know how it is? Let me tell you how it really is sort of guy, which paid dividends for me.
Had you ever done anything like that, writing a story previously?
No, I mean, I think everything with writing, you're just built on a series of Hail Marys of like, oh, I wonder if this person will like this idea. Oh, it's cool, like this website, whoever is down to run it. And then you're like, well, now I have to talk to the source and make sure that they're, you're constantly lining things up like that. But certainly pulling somebody else in on a harebrained scheme, this was the first time I'd done that or gotten up that early. I
mean, this is a weird one for me to ask because I do stuff for Quartersnacks so regularly. But to you, what was Quartersnacks as an outlet at that point in time, and why did you think it would tonally be a good fit for this story beyond its focus on New York?
I guess as a child of that late Web 2.0 era, Quartersnacks has been on my radar for a long time. And I had always just admired Costa's voice in general.
Just a quick editorial interjection to say that's Kosta Sacek, founder, editor of Quartersnacks, the snack man.
He has a unique voice within skateboarding that I think that kind of style of writing has become a little bit more normalized at this point.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Writing about skateboarding from the perspective of the Tompkins bench, by which I mean I really appreciated references to like contemporary rap music and like interactions with culture at large, like, like talking about going out. And I've spoken to Costa probably a handful of times in person, but I believe we're about the same age. And yeah, it was like a very different, and it felt like much more tailored to what I was interested in reading in my early 20s than anybody else in skateboarding, I think, was writing at the time.
How'd you go in with the pitch?
I pitched a simpler version, I think, of what we initially talked about, which was just kind of like a slice of life of what goes into maintaining it. He's a fun person to write for because there aren't a ton of deadlines. I was working as a bartender at the time and was devoting even less time to writing. So I didn't feel a ton of pressure to like crank something out, but I was able to kind of just keep going along and send him updates, and he'd be like, oh, that's cool, we should talk about this too. Or like, hey, I thought about this and maybe I was thinking about including, some color or perspective from this angle. And he was like, oh yeah, that sounds really cool. You could talk to this person about it. As I was writing it, I came to realize some of the broader stuff about what I talked about how this was the first one in a wave of skate parks and the way that it had kind of transformed the city's perception within the industry. It grew organically over the course of 7 months of writing.
Sit down. Give me that.
Tear up page 1, run that photo instead.
Headline?
Spider-Man, hero or menace? Exclusive Daily Bugle photos.
Menace? He was protecting that armored
I'll tell
car.
you what,
from us.
Atticus, you take the pictures, I'll make up the headlines, okay? All right? That okay with you?
Yes, sir.
Goody.
I have been very thankful for every opportunity and every editor that has ever greenlit anything that I've done. But generally speaking, working with skate editors, the most back and forth I get is early on, before I've started writing, kind of fleshing out a pitch and like, maybe we should look at this angle or work this sort of stuff into. There's not a lot of that minutia. Do you want to schedule and have a 20-minute phone call so that you can get one sentence out of this? Christian Kerr doesn't work as an editor anymore, but he is one of the few other people that I can talk about that consistently was doing, which was really cool, but I had not dealt with a lot of it. Costa was really good with this as well.
Spider-Man wasn't attacking the city. He was trying to save it. That's slander.
It is not. I resent that. Slander is spoken. In print, it's libel.
I think we should find a segue in to talk about the archetypal writer who's like has an almost adversarial relationship with editors. I haven't really experienced a ton of that. My writing experience is all based on journalism school. And like I went straight from that to skateboarding, which is this very hands-off thing. I was left oftentimes thinking to myself, I don't know if this is how the real world works in terms of writing or not. It helped me grow as a writer to have that hands-off approach because it forced me to hand off more completed work, not expecting any help and just trying to anticipate these questions. And, you know, like you finish the piece and you're like, well, is there anything that I'm missing here? Does this check all the boxes? Do I have any red flags hanging that I think when I was in college, I would have kind of just like turned in a draft to get it done and waited for feedback and kind of put more thought into the next draft? Yeah, it was a lot of trying to learn how to do all of that myself.
I guess one of the last things I want to ask is, what are your thoughts on going for those stories in general, where initially you might think, is this too niche of an idea or an angle for a story? Do you find that those are usually the ones that end up being the most fun? Like, the idea of who's going to care about this story can be like, yeah, no one's going to care about it, or it might really strike a chord with people. Here we are, for instance, 2 years after you wrote the story, talking about it for this thing.
So we'll say there's a point of reference for this piece that I borrowed heavily from. There's a former New York Daily News columnist named Jimmy Breslin. He has a very famous piece that I read about in journalism school, and I think probably a lot of other people have read in similar academic settings. In November of 1963, he profiled a guy named Clifton Pollard, who was the gravedigger at Arlington National Cemetery. It's written from the perspective of him waking up on Sunday morning and going to work to dig JFK's grave. This like fascinating angle to look at this huge newsworthy event, tons and tons of barrels of ink spilled over it. And it's just like finding an interesting through line in it. You know, like that to me, I wanted to write about the L.E.S. Park. I knew that 10 years were coming up and that it had some level of impact on skate culture in the city. But it was like, what can I really say about this that will say anything new about it? There's like nothing new to explain in a lot of ways, but it's ultimately just like, well, what does it really take to run it then? And I think that there are ways to do that with anything, you know, even if it's I sent you that story that I wrote for Jenkum about pro skater health insurance. I remember it was like around the time they were trying to kill the Affordable Care Act that came out, reading a lot about that in the newspaper, and Alexis Castro at Jenkum had said maybe something about pro skaters getting health insurance on Twitter, that sort of thing. And it was another like, oh yeah, moment, knowing that pro skaters are independent contractors, which means that they're not getting health insurance. And yeah, the point of all of that is to say that there are like big monolithic ideas that might seem difficult to write about. There's no skate newsrooms. You don't have like a lot of resources as a skate writer. And if you want to take on a project that is bigger, you have to figure it out yourself. And like I said, the press department at the parks department is not going to respond to you or take you seriously sometimes, but there's still ways to like find an interesting through line in there. And it's just a matter of like thinking critically about it. And then at some point in time, yeah, you have this kind of on the bench at the spot conversation, or like you're talking to your friend at the bar and you're like, holy shit, that's the little detail that you can use to kind of like You know, Nestor, he's the main character of the story. He ties everything together. He ties the history and the way that Parks operates and all of those things. I think it's just about getting lucky and finding those through lines that you can take and like run and use it as a fracture in the facade to like get in and start addressing bigger stuff.
Thanks for joining us. You can check out the show notes for this episode for a bunch of reading material related to it at skatebylines.com. We've included the Jimmy Breslin piece titled It's an Honour, which Ian was referring to. If you're familiar with Skate Bylines before today, you might have caught Breslin's name in a previous article I wrote, and I very much recommend picking up the Essential Writings of Breslin, published by the Library of America. It's a really wonderful book. You can read Ian's full story, which was the subject of today's episode, over at Quartersnacks by looking up Civic Centre, a profile of the L.E.S. skatepark at 10 years. You can also be directed to the piece via the Skate Bylines site. Again, that's skatebylines.com, where Ian's story is under our editor's picks section. In the meantime, you can keep up with Skate Bylines on Instagram at Skate Bylines and on Blue Sky under the same handle. And if you've got a piece of skateboarding journalism you've particularly enjoyed, let us know. It doesn't have to be written, it could be in any format. It doesn't even have to be from a skateboarding publication. You can get in touch by email to skatebylines@gmail.com. And if you've got a piece of your own work that you're particularly proud of, by all means send that over for us to take a look at too. Thanks again, I've been your host Farran Golding, and I edited and produced this episode. You've been listening to a podcast by Skate Bylines, a spot for skateboarding journalism.